We're going to talk about end-to-end teaching, learning, and assessment in the communicative language classroom, but I am fully aware, just like the question that was made right now, that assessment is a scary word. Assessment makes you think of like going to the doctor with your exam results and you're scared of what the doctor's going to say. It feels a bit like that. Do I pass? Do I fail? How do I do that? It's such a terrible thing. So I thought, in Rome, do as the Romans do. Let's not talk about assessment. Let's talk about coffee. So, what makes a cup of coffee good or bad? And there are a number of things that we take into consideration. I mean, if you think about qualities that make it, yeah, obviously the taste. But not just that, it's more. There are things about the texture, there are things about the presentation of the cup of coffee. There are many like aspects, angles into the way we think of coffee. And there are actually people that judge coffee for a living, so they make sort of lots of studies about these things. So, what makes coffee good or bad? According to the people that actually do this for a living, these are the things that they evaluate. These are the things that they focus on when they are judging a cup of coffee. So sweetness is one. What is the element of sweetness? What kind of sweetness is there in the coffee? Body, the texture, how it feels in your mouth. The difference between filter coffee and a strong cup of espresso that feels like it's made of mud or something. So what is the body of that coffee? The acidity, sort of balancing the sweetness. There is a natural acidity in coffee, so is it too much, is it too little, does it come from where? Flavors, what kind of flavors? You know how this pretentious wine thing, like, yeah, cherries and chocolate and fine grilled meat and a bit of feijoada as well. That's a cup of coffee, dude. So, but anyway, you see people talking about that. And then finish. How does it feel, sort of what happens after? So these are the different things that they're focusing on, that they're looking at, the different things that can make a cup of coffee good or bad. It's not that one is good, the other isn't. It's just that these are the aspects that they balance. Now, we need to be more specific. I mean, if we want to be more specific, can we describe this? So I did the same thing. I started Googling and looking at how people who do this professionally, who judge coffee competitions and actually coffee competitions themselves, how do they define what is body? Because body is, this amazing stuff. But body in coffee obviously has to mean something different. Well, this is how they define it. This is the weight and feel of the coffee on your tongue. Hey, that's pretty descriptive. I mean, it's nothing flowery or anything. It's just a sort of physical description. Does the coffee feel like skim milk or heavy like whipping cream? Okay, this is a definition we can work with. If I want to explain to you what body of coffee is, and I tell you this is what the body of coffee is, I'm describing it in a way that is quite that actually can be transmitted, can be understood. Now, can we break this down? Because if we are going to actually think of how would we actually make like a scale of coffee, then we need to be more specific than this. What do we mean by the weight and feel of the coffee on your tongue? So, and again, this comes from professional judges. To evaluate the body of a coffee sample, tasters will consider the thickness, the creaminess, and the viscosity of the brewed coffee. A high-quality coffee will have a full and satisfying body that enhances the overall sensory experience. So, this is giving us three aspects. It's telling us that for body, we want to separately consider the thickness, the creaminess, and the viscosity. Now, how about rubrics? Rubrics is a word that we teachers are familiar with. Now, thinking of these, if we were going to have our own Cambridge Brazilian teacher coffee competition, if we want to have like the perfect blend of coffee for English teachers in 2024, wouldn't that be a cool thing? Just a side note to my good friend João Madureira and the amazing team in Brazil, I hope they have free bags of the Cambridge coffee of 2024 outside of, no, no such things. But probably for 25. So, how about rubrics? How would we describe that? And again, looking at the standards from coffee competitions, they describe a full-bodied coffee as this: strong, pleasant, with a tactile sense of viscosity; medium body, and then a description of that, a coffee that seems diluted and poor to espresso lovers, but the right amount of body to consumers preferring filtered coffee; and then finally round body, and then we have a description of that. Now, if I give you these, and you are trained or you have some experience judging coffee, then you can easily, or we should all be able to take cups of coffee, drink them, taste them, sample them, and then define into which of these categories each of the cups of coffee that we are drinking fits. And this way, we are able to actually go into a coffee competition. We are not just assessing body. We are not just assessing good coffee. We are looking at which of these more sort of specific, descriptive, I hate to use the word objective, but more objective things work. If we were teaching coffee instead of teaching English, imagine that we were teaching a course on coffee. Then how would we design a coffee quality syllabus? Well, we would be talking about each of the different things that make coffee good or bad, and we would make sure that we have units in our course that address each of these things, and many others, I'm sure. I'm not such a big expert on coffee, I just like cup. Then what if we had a unit for coffee body, what activities would we include? Well, definitely we would have a reflection on the different qualities of different kinds of body in coffee, on the standards for that, what we like, what we don't like, what makes, sort of a lot more detail about this. And then what kind of tests would we design for our coffee course? Yes, we would have sampling, tasting tests, but then we would also need to do other stuff like tests on coffee theory. Do you remember what the 5 qualities I mentioned at the beginning are? How much do you know about them? How much do you know about the history of coffee, about the areas of Brazil where coffee is grown and why it is better than those people in Colombia? You know, they think they have coffee, but they're not Brazilians. Now, but why am I talking about coffee? Recapping, what have we done? We have chosen a subject, coffee. We defined that subject in theory, what makes coffee good or bad. We turned that definition into observable features, things we can look at. We defined a criteria for that feature. We described the body and how we define it. We designed a syllabus for our coffee course, and then an evaluation tool. This is the end-to-end process for a coffee course. But we are not here to talk about coffee. Well, okay, we have done each of these things in order. And now it's time to talk about English. Because unfortunately, I mean, it would be nice to teach coffee for a living, but English is what we do. Now, what are we teaching and assessing? Let's begin from our definition of what it is that we do as language teachers. Let's go from the very beginning, because my promise to you is that this session is going to be about the end-to-end process. And I'm going to start talking about the very start. What is it that we teach? And then let's go step by step, just like we did with coffee, to see if we can get from that to the test at the end of the process. So, the first thing is that we all agree, or most of us agree, and if anybody doesn't, I'm happy to have that conversation some other time, we need a couple hours, that we are teaching language as communication. That we are not teaching English because people want to understand the grammar of English, the syntax of English, what is the difference between a prepositional verb and a phrasal verb, or a phrasal prepositional verb, or whatever. Well, that basically means 2 things. The first one is that language is a tool. Language is a tool that we use to do things, which is why the frameworks that we use when we talk about English and when we describe English, we don't talk about, I know 50 different verbs and I know 20 different tenses, we say, I can do this in English. Because at the end of the day, no one is interested in how many verbs I know. They're interested in, can I make myself understood? Can I understand you? I want language to do things. Language is a tool. And the other thing is that language is a competence. So, and actually, if you think of a Cambridge exam is deep down a very simple thing. It is a test of communicative competence. If only life were that simple. So let's break down the idea of competence, the concept of competence. So unpacking communicative competence, at Cambridge we work within the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. And that framework defines competence as the sum of knowledge, skills, and characteristics that allow a person to perform actions. That means that there are things I know, there are things I can do using those things I know. And there are characteristics, there are things that I am. When we talk about things like employability skills, life competencies, many of those things fall into, a lot of that overlaps with things like my characteristics as a person, my general communication skills, my general attitude to other people. And those things allow a person to perform actions. So I use all of those things, the things I know, the things I do, the things I am, to do things. So that is what a competence means. Okay, so far so good. Now, when we talk about communicating, all human competencies contribute in one way or another to a language user's ability to communicate. So I communicate with my English competence, but also with my employability competence, with my life competencies, with my collaboration, with my empathy. Can I put myself in your shoes? Can I see things from your perspective? Because if I can see things from your perspective, it is going to make me better at putting my message in a way that is going to be clear to you, that is going to answer your question, that is going to be accessible to you. The examples I use are going to be examples which are relevant to you. Now, when we talk about, so the framework talks about all human competencies collaborate to help us communicate. This includes general competencies and then communicative language competence specifically. The general competencies are interesting for us to know, but we are going to put them aside for this session. We talked about them in our previous session, and there was a lot of that when we talked about what makes a project successful, and there will be a lot of that in the rest of the day. But for now, let's focus on the other bit. So general competencies are not specific to language. We use them for all activities, including language, like our knowledge of the world, our intercultural skills, our ability to learn, etc., etc. Now, communicative language competence covers linguistic competence, social linguistic competence, and pragmatic competence. So, what is that? Linguistic competence is lexis, grammar, semantics, what we think of as the grammar and vocabulary bit, the more classic, hardcore learning English stuff. Social linguistics are things to do with how we manage social relationships, politeness, our register, how we manage different codes of politeness, how we use language to present ourselves as one thing or another, things like the implications of accent and dialect. And our pragmatic competence is basically discourse and functional, because at the end of the day, syntax is going to help you make correct sentences, but we don't speak in sentences. We speak, and we don't write one sentence after another. We need to put a whole text together. Those are our discourse competence. So when we talk about things like cohesive devices, coherence, how we put a text together, all of those things are part of our pragmatic discourse functional competence. So this is the way in which we can break down communicative competence specifically. Now, from communicative language competence come communicative activities, things that we do with language. And those are familiar to us, because it's basically reception, and production, the classic ones. And then mediation, my good friend Alberto Costas, this is a word that is very close to his heart. And interaction. And these skills, or these communicative activities, come in oral and written form. So what do we call reception of oral? We call that listening. What do we call production written? We call that writing. Okay? So far, so good? So this is how we come to the classic model of the 4 skills, which we are now making more complex, but that's a subject for another day. Okay, so we have chosen a subject, and we have defined that subject in theory. Now, when I say communicative competence, we know what we are talking about. What about assessment? What about assessment? Here, thank you. What is assessment anyway? So the first thing, just like we define competence, let's very quickly define what we mean by assessment. And I'm going to use a definition from, not by me. I wish I were as clever as the person that wrote this, a legend in the world of assessment, who passed away sadly a year ago, called Tim McNamara. And he said that assessment is a process of observing evidence from performance. Basically, we need assessment because I don't know if anybody here is into the idea of brain-based teaching, but anyone will agree that we are not at the stage where I can open a window into your head and see the present perfect swimming in there and see if it is shaping up, if it is firmly connected to all the island of the simple past, or not. We are not there. So what can I do to see how your learning of the present perfect is going? Well, I need to assess you. And to assess you, I need to ask you to do something using the present perfect. So I observe what you do, and then I interpret that. This is correct, this is incorrect, this is what I expected, this is not what I expected. And then I do something. I reach a conclusion about what you know and what you can do. And then, for many people, this is where the definition of assessment ends. But you're missing the most important step of all, in my opinion. Any ideas of what it can be? Then we drink a nice cup of coffee with rounded body? No, not that. In order to make decisions based on those conclusions. Because actually the point of assessment is not we have a test and the results are going to go into your report card. The point of assessment is I want to have an insight into how your learning process is going. What things you can do, what things have been acquired, what things are still struggling, so that I can make a decision. Are you ready to move on to the next unit, or do you need more practice on this? Are you ready to move on to the next course, or do you still have some competencies that you need to work on at this level before you move to the next level? Do you have what it takes to do, well, let's not talk about English, let's talk about a driver's exam. Do you know enough about driving to go out in the streets of Sao Paulo with a car? Do I give you a driver's license? And their life competencies are very important because it's important that you know how to move a car, but there is an attitudinal thing. Are you suicidal enough to go into the streets of Sao Paulo? Do you have a death wish? Now, that should be part of a test, shouldn't it? Now, anyway, important things about this definition is that we cannot really talk about assessment. We cannot define it without talking about learning, without talking about teaching. It is the same thing. And we cannot talk about assessment without talking about what we do next. Assessment is not an end in itself. Assessment is not a way of getting numbers and letters. It's a way of making decisions about learning that need to improve learning. Are we okay so far? Yep? Now, functions of assessment, and this is a classic one. I wish I had, the person that came up with this analogy is a guy called Scriven, the first person to define the concept of formative assessment back in 1967, I think. And he said that these two people are doing assessment, but they are doing it differently. So when the chefs do it, it's formative assessment. When the people on the table are doing it, it is summative. The chefs, and we tend to think of those as either one or the other. So when the chefs taste the food, when the chefs are cooking, they are deciding, is this ready? Does this need more salt? How do we do this? How is this going? And then that's formative. When it goes on the table, they're making a judgment of the finished plate. And they are deciding whether it's good enough or not, whether it meets expectations or not. Well, it's not that different really, because in terms of assessment, my proposal to you today, my idea to you today, I'm going to go into details now, is that summative and formative is not an either one or the other. It is more of, well, more formative, more summative, and they have one thing in common, which is that they are both focused on the learning. So it's two orientations of assessment with one common goal. If you are interested in formative assessment at all, the names Paul Black and Dylan William, Paul Black, Dylan William, are names you need to Google and become very familiar with. And they wrote that assessment becomes formative when the evidence is actually used to adapt the teaching work to meet the needs. So what makes a kind of assessment or an instance of assessment formative is not that we do it at the end of the unit or the end of the course, that it is a quiz or an exit ticket or that it is a big test at the end. What makes it formative is that we use the information that we collect with the assessment to adapt the work that we do when we teach, to meet the needs of our learners, to get to better learning. It is a way of using that information that is formative. It is not, this is a quiz, this is a Cambridge English qualification. So, and they went on to explain this in a bit more detail. So, they wrote in 2009, the assessment is formative to the extent that evidence about student achievement, remember that assessment is a way of collecting evidence, is elicited, so extracted, interpreted and used, so what makes assessment formative is what it does, not what it is. Okay. By teachers, by learners, by their peers. So this is not just something that the teacher does. We need to work on peer assessment, we need to work on self-assessment. To make decisions about the next steps, so far I am saying the same thing I told you 5 slides ago. I am very repetitive. That's why they call me teacher. So, to make decisions about the next steps in instructions, so the focus is on the next steps, that are likely to be better or better founded than the decisions they would have taken in the absence of the evidence that was elicited. Wait a minute, what was that? So basically, at the end of the day, the one thing that matters about any kind of assessment that you do, any assessment activity that you do, any test, any exit ticket, any do you understand, raise your hands if you do, any kind of assessment is, with the information that you get from that assessment, the decisions that you make afterwards, are they better than the decisions you would have taken if you had not done whatever you did? That is the ultimate test of tests. The assessment of assessment. Is this helping me make better decisions? And a part of the secret is, am I using the right assessment tools? Am I using a good test? But we're talking about Cambridge, so the tests are good already. The other half of the equation is, am I using those good tests well? Am I getting all the potential out of that assessment? And that is in our hands. We can take a so-so assessment instrument and do cool things with it. We can take an awesome assessment instrument and not do much. So, basically what I'm telling you is simple maths, going back to our coffee. There is teaching plus assessment equal learning, right? Wrong. So going back to coffee, and here, this is an intersection between Brazil and Japan. This is coffee meets Zen. So look at this lovely latte. There is no coffee. There is no milk. What is the only thing you see? There is only latte. There is no coffee. There is no milk. Where does the coffee begin? Where does the milk end in my beautiful cup of latte? If it was a cup of cappuccino, kind of. But I'm talking about latte here. There is no coffee, there is no milk, there is only latte. There is no learning, there is no teaching, there is no assessment. There is only the learning process and what we do to make it better. That is why they call me teacher. That, and that I repeat myself a lot. So far, so good? Cool. Awesome. Because then we can talk about the end-to-end process and what it looks like in more English detail. Because so far we have been very fluffy about coffee and the competence and difficult words and black and William and yellow and Jones. But let's get down to brass tackles. Let's talk about hardcore teaching stuff. So, we chose a subject, we defined it, we talked about competence and what we do with it. Now, let's turn that definition into observable features, and let's define a criteria for one of those features, talking about the thing we do, which is English. Okay. So, where it starts, the whole process begins for us when we look at, if you work within the Common European Framework, like all Cambridge materials, all Cambridge assessment, most of the work that we do, we can look at definitions like this. This is the self-assessment statement, so like the broadest global, the global scale descriptor for the level B1. This is what level B1, this is the most generic, shortest, accessible, simple definition of B1. A B1 person can understand the main points of clear standard inputs. Well, you can do the reading. We are going to focus on this. A person, a B1 user of English, or a B1 user of language, because this is not an English-specific scale, can describe experiences and events, can give reasons and explanations for opinions and plans. Okay, let's narrow it down to those two specific activities. Can describe experiences and events, can give reasons and explanations for opinions and plans. Are you with me? So, if we break this down a little bit more, the self-assessment grid from the Common European Framework says that for spoken production, this translates as I can briefly give reasons and explanations for opinions and plans, I can narrate a story or relate the plot of a book or film and describe my reactions. And for writing, this translates as I can write personal letters describing experiences and impressions. This is the framework. If it looks very similar to the activities in B1 preliminary from the Cambridge English qualifications, if you know the exam, that is not a coincidence. Now, how do we make those things visible? Well, we need to think about the features of, in this case, written production that are going to reflect those things. Just like we looked at the body, the sweetness, the acidity of the coffee, just like we looked at those aspects, these are the aspects that we're going to look at in Cambridge to talk about writing, our 4 assessment subscales for writing. When we look at a piece of writing, we look at the content, we look at something we call communicative achievement, we look at something we call organization, and we look at something we call language. And then, at level B1, we define the expectation for each of those things. So here you have, and this comes from the teacher's handbook, this is not the secret formula of anything, this is all material you can Google. Actually, it's in the teacher handbook for all of our exams. You can see that we define what we expect from a B1 user of English for each of these competencies, or for each of these sub-areas of this aspect of writing competence. So far, so good? Okay, then we dive into levels of performance, because this is what the people that are going to actually grade our exams see. What they see is a list of 5 bands and descriptors for different levels of performance. What is considered good enough, what is considered excellent, what is considered not too great. Okay? For each of the aspects. This is what allows us to make sort of accountable grades, accountable judgments. You can see what they look like for each of the different areas we described. Organization, language, communicative achievement. The next step is where we start thinking about what do I do with my course that begins next week? What do I teach? Which is, how do we go from all of these fluffy concepts of ideas and la into my lesson on Monday, or Unit 5 of my course book? Okay, the next step is to turn all of this into a teaching curriculum. Well, this is Unit 5, actually, from Think 2nd edition, a book published by, Cambridge. Look at this bit. So this is one unit in this course, which is a B1, which is a course that is developing B1 competence, okay? Now, telling a story. Remember that narrating events in the past is one of the things that is expected of B1 users for written production. So we are going to include materials in our curriculum that have to do with telling a story. We're going to focus on grammar elements that allow us to tell a story. In this case, relative pronouns, relative clauses. Then, in terms of vocabulary, we're going to look at elements of a story, types of story. We're going to look at things that allow us to talk about stories and to organize the way we do stories, storytelling. We're going to think about different writing styles. And then we're going to read an article series about how to give opinions, because there are always 2 sides to an argument. And if you remember the descriptors that we read from B1, there was something there about expressing your opinions, your likes, your dislikes. So this unit is going to focus on all of that. So far we defined what we expect from this level of competence, and of course, the curriculum, the content of my course, has to be very coherent with that. It has to follow a thread. There has to be a line, a sequence, a story. And then, so you want to write a novel, do you? It's an interesting story. Do you? Yeah, we're teachers. We all have a story inside us. We just choose to tell it in lessons, not novels. And many teachers become novelists. Why not? With all of these things, plus how to write a short paragraph expressing an opinion, it is very clear that whoever wrote this unit was thinking about those B1 definitions. So we go from the framework to the curriculum. Now, the first thing we need to do then is to teach it, to present it globally. So how do we do that? Again, Think 2nd edition from that Unit 5. First, we're going to do a listening activity on telling a story. Then we're going to read, so you want to write a novel, do you? And then we're going to have our general life competencies, our meta-learning, our reflection, our critical thinking aspects of thinking about writing styles, what makes a good story, and then learning about storytelling in the Caribbean. So these are the ways in which the unit presents global issues or global things related to storytelling. Now, we have to teach the mechanics, because to do all those things, we need to do language, basically. So, this is where we begin with some aspects of grammar and lexis and syntax that we are going to need to tell our stories, beginning with grammar, relative pronouns. And this is where we practice that. This is where we learn about words that we can use to describe the different things in the stories that we tell. This is where we look at speaking activities that connect to our reflection. What do we think makes a story good? And then, what kind of stories do you enjoy? All of these things that can put you in the frame of mind of the mechanics of writing a good, gripping story with correct English. Then, those things that we learned in terms of syntax, grammar, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah, we need to practice individually, methodically. First one, then another. We're going to practice the grammar. By the way, if you've been listening to me, this is a perfect assessment moment, because when we give feedback to our learners, what are we doing? Formative assessment, if we do it right. So, we designed a syllabus, we designed an evaluation tool. That is the thing that we've done, kind of. Because then, also in that book series, we see a very explicit way of doing ongoing assessment. On doing assessment as we do the course, which is basically activities that come in the form of unit tests or mini tests. And then extension tests, because another aspect of good assessment is that it has to match where my learners are. Some learners are going to be more advanced than others. We usually worry about the ones that are struggling, but we don't tend to focus so much on the ones that do really well. Well, this is a great way to do exactly that, an extension test, because we have a test. Some students are ready for a bit more challenge. Let's give them a bit more challenge with an extension test. And now we go beyond what is in a course book. And I'm going to start showing you the way this systematic assessment of the skill happens in the summative exam. The summative exam for B1 is B1 preliminary for schools within the Cambridge universe. And we see here that the first thing we're testing is the mechanics. Here we have to fill in gaps, and we have to complete those gaps with words which are usually grammar items and lexis items. Then, once we have done the mechanics, we do them with a little bit more challenge, because now we don't have a multiple choice question, we have an open close. Isn't that cool, open close? But this is close with a Z. So an open close is where you have a gap, you have a blank, but no suggestions for what goes in the blank. So you could write anything. Well, not anything, but something that fits. So in this case, which is one more level of challenge from the previous exercise, because I'm not giving you choices. And then I'm going to test your performance. This is what this is one of the tasks in the writing test, in the writing component of preliminary. And here you read an email, and then you have these notes of things you have to do. You have to write a response to that email. So first of all, this is a writing test, but it starts with reading, and it's actually an interaction. And then what do you have to do? You have to explain, you have to suggest, and you have to tell something. So you have to do things with writing, and the things you need to do have to do with telling something, so kind of like storytelling, it's that component, and then explaining and suggesting, and in the suggesting it's what I like, what I don't, my preferences. All of these things come from where? Remember those global scale descriptors of blah, blah, blah? It's a straight line from one to the other. And then the second part is actually asking you to write basically an opinion piece about things that you prefer. So in this case, what do you find funny? Do you think it's good to laugh a lot? So talking about your views, talking about your opinions, talking about your preferences. Where does that come from? Again, if you remember all the way back to those B1 things. So basically that's the job done. Because we have chosen a subject, we're going to do English, we're going to do communicative competence. We have defined that subject. We talked about what we understand by competence and communicative competence and the aspects of communicative competence. We turn that into observable features. How do we know? Well, we know because in the writing, I am going to see it in your discourse, I'm going to see it in your content, I'm going to see it in your communicative achievement, I'm going to see it in your language. And then we define a criteria, because in Cambridge we assess with these bands, and we defined for B1 what does each of the bands have. But we also did the same thing from the curriculum end, to teach what B1 expects learners to be able to do. I need you to be able to do this, and that. How do we break this down into a syllabus? How do we break this down into things I can teach? How do we incorporate different stages of assessment that are super coherent, super aligned with that curriculum, with that expectation, with those definitions? Then we designed our syllabus, and then we designed our evaluation tools, the ones that we do during and the ones that we do at the end. So that's the job done, right? We can all go home now? Not yet. There is something really important that is missing. Ideas? The last step is that we need to make decisions about that. Because you can have, like I said before, you can have the best assessment instruments, but if you don't do anything with that information, it's like your doctor asks you to do a lot of tests on your blood and your X-rays and blah, blah, and then you go to the doctor with all of your tests and you give your results to the doctor. Your doctor doesn't look at the results, puts them on the desk and say, okay, this is what we're going to do now. Would you like to will you go to that doctor again? No. Now, imagine that you do a test, like B1 preliminary, but then the only thing you do with the results is a beautiful ceremony where you hand out the certificates, everybody claps, everyone's happy, the parents cry, they always do. You remember that course and you cry for different reasons, but then with those results, you don't do anything else. Have you really done assessment? Not really. You haven't made decisions based on that. What could you do? Well, that is a story for Cambridge Day 2025. So to be continued. Thank you very much.
I love the suspense at the end.
Always end with a cliffhanger.
Exactly. Next season, right? Thank you, Pablo, so much for that talk. I love how you, Alberto, and other assessment managers demystify assessment. It doesn't need to be something scary or complicated.
Absolutely not.
It's something we do all the time. We just don't notice that we're doing it.
Exactly. Many people ask, when do we do assessment? What is the right moment? If you're a teacher, if you're in the classroom, if you're giving feedback to your students, and giving feedback to your students is when you make the face or things like that. Every time you open your mouth, you're doing assessment. My question is, when is a teacher not doing assessment?
Exactly. That's amazing. All right, so we have some questions from our online viewers. Thank you for your participation. First, before the question, I have a compliment for you from Roberta Hinheto, I hope I pronounce it right, from Mato Grosso. She says, one of the clearest talks I've attended so far. The metaphors, examples are perfect.
Oh, I can only say thank you.
That's amazing. I'm glad you talked about coffee after we came back from the break.
Yeah,
because otherwise everybody...
It would have been cruel the other way around.
Before, perfect. Okay, so question for you. Do you want an easy or a difficult one?
Bring them on.
All right, so how to create assessment in a Brazilian education reality. Crowded classrooms, limited tools, and so on.
So, okay, cool. Now, In another session, another day, we can talk about the features that make assessment effective. But the main definition is that, yeah, there are things that make assessment good or bad. Like if you have a test of English where you don't have to use English, that's a bad test. But I am reading your aura and that tells me about your English, doesn't do anything. But beyond that, the important thing is that assessment needs to be fit for purpose. So it needs to match what you need to do, what you're trying to assess, and it needs to be practical and adequate in the context where you are. We look at things like challenges. The useful way to address that is to look at those things as features, characteristics. What is my reality? This is my reality. Is it perfect? It is my reality. So how do we choose within what is possible for me to do something that will address it? So are we going to have a test that is going to include 40-minute conversations with each individual students to assess speaking? Probably not. Are we going to, so what are we going to do? We are going to look at things that are doable. So we're going to do them in groups, conversations, which also makes sense because most of the times when you're speaking, you're having an interaction. You're not just talking to the wall. So you do things like that. When you think of a test, very often we teachers run away with our dreams. And we would like to ask each of our students to write 500 words, and then there goes my weekend. And the weekend after that. So maybe there are other kinds of activities that I can do. So always think about what is realistically doable. Do not think of limitations, think of, well, another day we can talk about another concept, the concept of what is an affordance, but think of those things like possibilities. What possibilities? Some positive, some give me more challenges. What can I do with what I have? There isn't a perfect way to do anything in a classroom, there is only the best one for my classroom.
Exactly.
So how do you do it? In a way that is fit for purpose.
And the teacher doesn't have to own 100% of the assessment all the time.
Absolutely not.
We think it's our job to do all the assessment. Oh, I'm the only one that's capable of assessing my students.
Exactly. Like, how do I feed 500 people if I am not a great professional cook? Well, one way to do it would be to buy food. So if you cannot, and what I'm trying to say is, sometimes the way to do it is to outsource it. People would call it in the world of industry. So maybe looking at things like what kind of things can a platform like Cambridge One give me that can do part of the assessment for me? What kind of things can an external assessment instrument do for me so that I don't have to do it myself, but I still have results that I understand, that I can trust, that I can use? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if that amazing recipe that impressed your mother-in-law was cooked by you or you bought it around the corner. It mattered that she liked it.
Amazing. It's a factory of good examples, right? Yeah. Okay, so we still have time for one more question. Question to the master. Look at that.
Where is the master?
Look at that. That's you, I think. From Claudia Cunico. Linguistic. In your opinion, which part of the linguistic study do you consider more engaging for an ESL teacher?
Okay, so engaging, whatever tickles your fancy, really. It depends. I mean, we all like what we like. If you're thinking of engaging in terms of useful, in terms of what is going to make it more practical, it really depends. I do believe that our capacity to do anything as teachers uses everything we know, uses all of our competence.
Right.
So everything I know goes into my teaching. And we see that a lot with people that have non-teaching, non-English passions. I've seen people who are great at drama, who love drawing, who love making music, who love cooking, who love... All of that feeds into the way they teach, finds its way into that. It's the same thing with the things that we study as teachers. We need to understand what we are teaching, so there are levels of, can I describe the language I'm teaching, is definitely sort of, it's not even important, it is essential.
Right.
It's a starting point. Beyond that, if you are more interested into the linguistics and how to sort of explain that in more detail and blah, 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 and how to put that to our students in ways that I understand, go for it. If you're interested more in the applied linguistics, the methodology aspect of things, then go for that. So I don't think there is one answer for that, but the one thing that is important is that, like sharks, we have to keep moving. A teacher is someone that worries about the learning of others, and we need to always be learning. So whatever you think you can bring into your classrooms, it is what you need. But always be bringing something.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.